America's Independence Day, the 4th of July. Written by Dr. Ishakamusa Barashango in Chapter 1 in the book titled African People and European Holidays. Mental Genocide. July 4th is a date annually set aside to commemorate the gathering of 54 land-grabbing thieves who were convened at the Second Continental Congress to determine their own destiny as white men, Euro-Americans, in a British-dominated colonial sphere, which at this time in world history, according to Brother Malcolm, it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. In order to comprehend the true meaning of this event from an African worldview perspective, black people must clearly understand that America's strike for independence from the British colonial empire, for all of its lofty proclamations of a liberty and justice for all, was in no way inclusive of the black population residing here in the 13 colonies. Most black people in colonial America were in bondage to white plantation owners and merchants. The only time that the black man was taken into account during this principal epoch of European American history was when the slave master stumbled on the idea that we could be used as their shields against British muskets, therefore minimizing for whites the risk of being mortally wounded. Thus, many slave owners sent their black bondsmen to the front line to serve as targets and cannon fodder for the protection of the not-so-patriotic colonial Americas. The War of the American Revolution was not commissioned with the objective of altering black people's status as hewers of wood and drawers of water, except to add more weights to our already back-breaking burdens and plunge us deeper into slavery. This is why we refer to this day as the 4th of July. The Euro-Americans blatantly lied to us when they promised us freedom if we would fight for the liberation from Britain and the tyranny of King George, as they called it. This was one of the bitterest lies in the history of the world, for the majority of black people in the United States were far worse off at the close of the Revolutionary War than they were before it began, especially with the coming of the cotton gin in 1793 and the evolution of King Cotton and its super role in the industrialization of the 18th century. Those eloquent lies about freedom, justice, and liberty for all did not include black folks in the all. Even at the time of the framing of the United States Constitution, blacks were considered to only be 3/5 of a person. This same lying to and unfairness of treatment and disenfranchisement of the black man on the part of the whites continues even unto this day of the much talked about Reaganomics, and before we as African people who reside here in the borders of the United States can set things right for ourselves, we must clearly understand the nature of the people who we're dealing with then and are forced to contend with now. That is the main purpose of this section, the 4th of July. In order for us to get a full grasp and comprehensive meaning of this event, we must stop here and take a panoramic view of a narrative outline of the history of the British Empire. As we proceed along this course, we should ever bear in mind that the historical phenomenon of the formation of the United States and its Revolutionary War was merely an extension of Great Britain's attempt at world empire. America's secession from Britain was merely the act of a wayward daughter rising in rebellion against her mother. For America is England's child through the unholy union of colonial exploitation and the African slave trade. As we shall clearly see further on in our studies, Britain was the stepdaughter of the Roman Empire, which was the illegitimate daughter of the so-called Greek civilization, which in its turn was the foster child of the high cultural civilizations of ancient Ethiopia and Egypt. Also in our academic travels, we shall further observe that during the long period of the African colonization of Greece and the other city-states in Mediterranean Europe, there was a renaissance of world order, technical and natural sciences in a high moral sense, the knowledge of right and wrong. This revival of civilization, as generated by African colonists in that area occurred around 500 BCE. Our cameo outline of the British Empire is in essence a case study of how most European nations generally developed and their resultant colonization of much of the 87% population peoples of color in the world. We are pursuing this line of study because it is important for us as a people to examine European history in its proper context, just as it is absolutely essential that we study our own history, African history, then place the two side by side for comparative analysis. This methodology will present us with a clearer picture of the true facts, which we as always should interpret from the perspective of an African worldview. The following sketches are not intended to be an exhaustive inquiry, but rather an overview portrait of the British Empire. In these studies, we will not attempt to enumerate all of the major events which took place in England or to chronologize the profiles of all of its monarchs. The main purpose of this outline is to touch on those episodes and personages that will provide us with a general background on the roots of British colonial expansion, the American Revolution, and the 4th of July. Proper treatment on the history of any nation, even one with a sparse ancient historical background such as that of Caucasianized Britain, cannot be adequately presented in a work of this nature. Nevertheless, the following narratives will serve to bring a clearer understanding of this segment of the European saga and how it has and does affect the historical phenomenon of African people. This and other subjects on the origin of European nations will be dealt with in a forthcoming work entitled The History of Europe and African Worldview. Through close observation, we ascertain that most of the streets, towns, cities, and states in the United States of America are named after English personalities and places. English is the official language of the United States and most of Canada, and it is widely used in Africa and many other parts of the world. This is one of the results of the British Empire's widespread expansionism and the exploitation of the overwhelming majority of peoples of color on the planet in general and enslavement of the African in particular. Therefore, in order to efficiently study the history of any nation of people in the world whose dominant language is English, it becomes necessary to inquire into the evolutionary development of the British Empire. For example, if we were to do an historical investigation of Nigeria, of Ghana, or any other African nation where English is predominantly spoken, we would need to study an outline of the British Empire. In the study of the American Revolution and its attending events, we are primarily concerned with the historical marvel of the 30 to 60 million English-speaking population of the new African nation here in America. In our learned quest, we will closely follow the advice and example of Dr. Chancellor Williams, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, and other black scholars who have admonished us to know our cultural enemy by studying and analyzing his culture and historical development, particularly as it relates to the African experience. The United Kingdom of Great Britain, which includes Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, is approximately the size of the state of Oregon. England proper is about the size of the state of New York. It is interesting to note how this little island, generally unsuitable for large populations within its own borders, once ruled much of the planet Earth. Just how this curious thing came to be is part of the subject matter covered in this narrative outline of the British Empire. Some may charge us as being one-sided in this particular account, but what must be understood is that in this presentation we are showing the other side of the coin. Previously, black people have generally been presented with a distorted view of world history, especially where we are concerned. Most textbooks written by European scholars have steadily reported the false notion that nothing of real value was happening in the world until they arrived. Hence the white man's, quote, discovery mania, end quote. Nothing could be further from the truth. European historians, anthropologists, social scientists, etc., have caused many people in the whole world to view things from a pan-European perspective. Now, in order to obtain a proper balance as we study this brief history of the development of the British Empire, it is imperative that we approach it from a new African worldview. We do understand that some chroniclers will exaggerate from time to time, for in the recording of events, all people like to make themselves look good. But in the case of most European writers, there is the tendency to cover up or play down their race's proverbial skeletons in the closet. In fact, most of them recorded outright prefabricated lies. In this presentation, we are endeavoring to help reserve that trend. Although many of the facts in this work are not generally known or reported in the context of an African worldview, they have nevertheless been well documented by thorough research. As the facts are laid out for you in this study, some may accuse me, as they did Joel A. Rogers, of trying to make everything and everybody of value in antiquity African. In a very real sense, this is a historical fact recorded in monuments of stone all over the world. For in the early days of Earth's history, the black man dominated the globe. We will approach this subject with some detail in the following chapter. To many who have been well conditioned by Europeanized thinking, this may come as somewhat of a shock and may cause some to outright reject it. So if, perchance, you find yourself becoming adverse to the acceptance of a black scholar's view, we suggest you check out some European writers on this subject, such as Sidney Godfrey Higgins, who in his work Anacalypsis, Volume 1, page 286 writes, "We have found the black complexion or something relating to it whenever we approach to the origins of nations." In another statement of that same volume on page 10, Higgins, in seeming frustration, says that whenever he went to study the origin of anything, he always ended up at something black. At one period during the black man's domination of the world, H.G. Wells, in A Short History of the World, records the state of most of the white race thusly. Away in the forests of Europe were the blond Nordic people, hunters and herdsmen. A lowly race, the primitive civilization saw very little of this race before 1500 BC. Similar statements concerning the dominance and high culture of the black race and the lowliest state of Europeans on the earth at that time have been made by such European writers as Strabo, Herodotus, Gerald Massey, and many others whom we shall encounter in our ensuing studies. Although many historians claim to be objective, very few, if any, of them ever are. All humans are subjected by something, and that something is usually blood, kinship, and cultural identity. As a result of white academia's obstructions and supposed objectivity, black people have been made to see the world and its history through another's eyes, and this has been going on for such a long period of time, and it makes it difficult for us to even begin to imagine our true place on the planet Earth. That is why those of us who are committed to the upliftment of the race advance the idea that must view all things through our own eyes and experience. That is an African worldview. Brother Haki R. Madhubuti, on the record Rise Vision Comin', in reference to the European outlook, states, "Their view of the world is not our view of the world. Their laughter is not our laughter. Their hurt is not our hurt." One of the best examples of this philosophy is the European trade to Africa, the slave trade. Most European writers on this period tried to make the heinous traffic of human flesh appear as an almost harmless secondary factor which was essential to European colonial expansion. In other words, what was good for them was very bad for us, which a careful study of history will show is usually the case. Even when the Europeans record African history, particularly in reference to Egypt, they have attempted to whitewash us almost completely out of it. But thanks be to the Creator. We do not have to depend on them to find out who we really are and what our true place is in the history of the world. In these times, we have been so abundantly blessed with a host of black scholars who have labored diligently to melt from the annuals of earth the dross of white academia and bring forth the pure gold of an African worldview. An old African proverb tells the history of a little bird who used to fly every day over a great expanse of jungle, and upon attracting the attention of the inhabitants of a certain village, relate the exploits of his victorious encounters with the strong and powerful male lion. One day a little boy inquired of his father, saying, "Father, how can a little bird such as this overpower and defeat a great lion? This indeed is incredible. Could his story in fact be true?" The father replied, "Son, we shall never know until one day the lion comes to our village and tells his story. Brothers and sisters, let's go on to tell our story. Unfortunately, there is the unpleasant reality that portions of our history are somewhat intertwined and connected with that of the European. This is a natural, or shall we say, unnatural occurrence in the ease of the evolution of the whites, since the black man is the first and the originator of everything true value on the planet Earth. Following is the story of how the barbaric inhabitants emerged from the caves of Europe, immigrated to England, and eventually became the British Empire, as seen through the eyes of the black man.